tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So here we are in the middle of this series on the 10 fetters, and we've come through the first 5, which are associated with the first 3 levels of awakening: stream entry, once returning, and non-returning. The once returning and non-returning refer to rebirths. So when you're a once returner and you've uprooted personality view and doubt about the path and belief in that rites and rituals can liberate, you've eliminated those with stream entry, and with once return you've weakened grasping at sense pleasures and hatred and ill will. Right? With grasping at sense pleasures and hatred and ill will weakened, but not gone, you can still be born into a body that has form, right? Because you still have desire for the senses, and so you need a body with senses in order to fulfill that. You still have kamma, right? Momentum in your system for being born into a body. With the third level of awakening, non-return, you uproot those 2 fetters of desire for sense pleasures and hatred and ill will. And so with that, particularly with the uprooting of the desire for sensory pleasures, you've also uprooted the desire to be born in a solid body. And so non-returners are thought of as being born only once more in a formless body. So once returning and non-returning are very similar, right? Once returning is like you'll have one birth, one more final birth before full awakening, but it'll be in a form-based body. And for the non-returners, you'll have one more birth before full awakening, but it'll be in a formless body. And so non-returners, if we go with this model that's in the text, it's non-returners who are going to be born once more, but they've lost the desire to be born in a sensory body. What do they still have desire for? And so the idea is that they've lost desire for sense pleasures, but they've retained the desire for meditative states, right? They still love the states of bliss that we call the jhanas, the absorptions, and they still love the states of formlessness called the arūpas, or formless absorptions or immersions. So then there are these 2 fetters, fetters 6 and 7, which are desire for the formless and desire for form and desire for the formless. And so number 6, desire for form, it's arūpa raga. So raga is desire or passion, rūpa is form. This is not desire for any of the forms in the sensory world. Those are already left far behind, right? You've already uprooted desire for sense pleasures, kama tanha, craving for the sensory pleasures. The rūpa raga, passion for form, here is a lingering delight in the experiences of the 4 form-based meditative states known as the jhanas. So first jhana, these are meditations that you can practice. They are the definition of samādhi in the tradition. So first jhana is characterized by aiming and sustaining attention, rapture and pleasure in the body based in seclusion from the senses, seclusion from the hindrances. The second jhana unfolds when aiming and sustaining of the mind are dropped, so the state deepens past efforting in that way, but retains rapture and pleasure born of concentration now. Third jhana drops the coarse aspect of rapture and just leaves the subtle contentment or ease known as sukha. And the fourth jhana drops all of the perceptions of pleasure and pain and rests in a state of profound balance, equanimity, and it says perfection of mindfulness. So these four states, these are culmination states in the practice of samādhi, of deep meditative absorption. And they're, in a way, they are the pinnacle of what one can find through meditative practice in the embodied sense. They're still embodied states. They are states where sometimes strong, sometimes subtler, pleasure is really the center of them. But it's not a pleasure dependent on the external sensations, of the sensory world. It's really pleasures dependent on seclusion from the senses and concentration, but they're still embodied. So they're called form jhanas, or form absorptions. And so the sixth fetter says, you haven't let go of those. You still love them. And even though you're so close to awakening that you're not going to be born in a physical body again, you could be born in a heaven realm characterized by one or another of these jhanas. After the jhanas, in the standard sequence, are four more states called the bases of sort of formless bases or formless states. Sometimes they're called formless jhanas. Most often they're just called the formless states, arūpa. And they begin with this fifth state, which is the perception or the base of infinite space. So the idea being that if you're resting in fourth jhana, where there's a very deep equanimity and stability, and attention is profoundly balanced and beyond pleasure and pain, that if you shift your attention just slightly, really, away from the form that you've been focused on, which might be at that point a very subtle perception of the breath or a very subtle perception of the body, you can shift to the sense that it comes very naturally that space is infinite. And so there can be a perception, and this very naturally comes not just in jhana, but even in lesser concentration states. You can slip into states where it feels like you can perceive the infiniteness of the universe, right? Or your awareness can be aware of the infinite scope of the universe. So if you tune into that, you may find yourself meditating with the infiniteness of space as the meditative object. So you've let go of the sense of the body, so it turns from an embodied state toward a disembodied state. The perception is beyond the sense of the physical body. You're perceiving the infiniteness of the universe. From there, if you shift your attention or let go of the spatiality of that perception, right? You're still sensing something spatial with that one. If you let go of that and you notice that if you're perceiving the infinite scope of the universe, the infiniteness of space, then the consciousness that's perceiving that must also be infinite. And so the sixth state is the base of infinite consciousness. You just drop the sense of spatiality, and there's the infinite spread of consciousness. Consciousness is infinite. From there, that's the next state. From there, you could recognize, oh, if I can perceive consciousness as infinite without perceiving the spatial nature of the universe, I can actually let go even of the sense that consciousness is anything, because it's not really resting on anything at that. It's resting on very little at that point. And the next state is the state of nothingness, the base of nothingness. So then you could say, oh, there is nothing. You're perceiving the absence of anything solid throughout the universe. That's the seventh of the states. And then the eighth goes beyond that. Where could you go beyond the perception of nothingness? And you could notice that even perception itself can kind of disappear, but not really. And there's a very deep, mysterious meditative state called the base of neither perception nor non-perception. So the perception of nothingness gets so subtle. If there's nothing, that includes perception. It gets so subtle that it would be hard to say whether you're perceiving or not. But when you come out of the state, you could be aware that like, oh yeah, there was a kind of perception, but it was so subtle. This is what it's called, neither perception nor non-perception. So these four states, infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception, these are the arūpas, the formless meditative states. And they are the result of concentration. They are, a very deep, mature samādhi. They are not themselves directly liberating, but they're profoundly supportive of liberation, because if liberation really consists of not grasping, and you've touched in meditation a state where the universe is infinite, consciousness is infinite, there's actually nothing in a very, very subtle way, you've had to let go of so much to find that meditation that in a way you're very, very close already to the full unbinding of nibbana. So these states are very close, but they're not themselves liberated. And so you can retain a desire for them. And so Fetters 6 and 7 refer to the lingering desire that the non-returner has for meditative states. Or, if you've got the full set of fetters, like, yeah, I haven't attained anything of note in the system, I have all 10 fetters, thank you very much, then, these two fetters are a way that you could think about, or inquire into that part of your personality, psychology, patterning that craves the simplicity, the pleasure, and the emptiness of these very deep meditative states. So from this point on in the sequence, we're talking about extremely deep things that don't let go easily. And so for a lot of us, this gets kind of, a little abstract, right? I'm still trying to keep my mind from wandering and stop obsessing about my past relationships and, things I have to do. So this is very distant from me, which is fine. But it's good first to know that the path goes here, like that it's actually possible to be at this point in your practice. But also, until the fetter is uprooted, it's with us. And so these don't just describe something that happens at the very mature end of practice. They describe a dynamic that is very deep and doesn't get eradicated till the very end of practice, but actually it's probably with you right now. And so you can see these fetters in the way that as you become a meditation practitioner and you like it, and particularly once you start to get a little bit of fruit of your practice, it starts to be the case that mindfulness and meditation have really been a good thing for you, and you've begun to develop, the practice a little bit, so that sometimes when you're practicing, you do land in states that are more peaceful than your ordinary consciousness, right? Whether these are jhāna states or something less, all of these states point toward aspects of practice that we can touch even in immature versions of in our ordinary practice. So anytime in your meditation practice when everything gets quiet for a while, it gets peaceful, the mind gets really spacious. And we talked about this a little bit on retreat last week. It's so easy to, when that happens, to be like, oh, I finally got it. Wow, I did it. I'm peaceful, and then like as soon as you start chatting about it, you're not peaceful anymore. But you could have a delicious meditation, you probably have, or you wouldn't have been coming back to do this again and again, week after week, you know? You have had delicious meditations that are peaceful, that feel nourishing. And it's very difficult coming out of those, you know, or over the long arcs of your practice to not, um, you know, to not really crave those meditations, to say, you know, like, oh, I had this wonderful morning meditation. It was so clear, so peaceful, so present. And then you spend the whole rest of the day or the whole rest of the retreat or several years of practice trying to recreate that one meditation that, of course, was a product of conditions, cannot be repeated, right? We don't want our meditation practice to be like, you know, like pulling a slot machine. Like maybe you'll luck out and get a little jackpot, but most of the time you don't because the house always wins. Like it's not actually a kind of gamble where you sit down for meditation and you're like, let's hope it goes well this time because it's out of my hands, right? Um, it's sort of out of your hands, like the conditions that give rise to the quality of your meditation in a given moment are complex, you know, and if you could control those conditions in such a way that you could make it, you know, certain that you would have a wonderful meditation, um, well, you could sell that formula for a lot of money and a lot of people would buy it if it was reliable, you know. And of course, there's hella people who want to sell you the app or the medicine or the tinfoil helmet that will make that, you know, happen, like reliable deep meditation. But the conditions are numerous, right? All the conditions of your life contribute to the tone of your mind in a given moment. And a huge part of the path is about constructing the conditions to make it most likely that you will have these kinds of meditations, not because they're random and you just want to sort of luck into them more often, but because they're actually a kind of art that you can practice. Right? And I talk a lot about practicing music because that was the form that I did most of, music and dance. But you could think about this in terms of any art that has discipline but also sensitivity to it. You know, um, it's possible to practice a lot, like on an instrument, and become very technically facile, but not really have a deep heart for music. And so then you can play a lot of notes, but maybe it doesn't communicate so well with others. I've heard some players like that. Other times you can have, you know, relatively less proficient technique, but a lot of soul. I've heard some players like that. But whatever, you know, wherever you are in that realm, it's always going to be the case that practice and developing your art, you know, whether you're a technician or a feeling type, you're still going to need to practice and develop your facility on the instrument in order to be able to have the vocabulary and the facility that you want to use in your art. So think of meditation like this, that you're cultivating a skill, particularly concentration skill, but also, you know, inquiry, exploration, you know, investigation as a skill. You're cultivating these, and as you cultivate them, it becomes more likely that you'll land in these beautiful meditations, not just for a couple of reasons then. One is because you've cultivated as a skill, and the other is that so much of the path is structured to make it more likely, you know, that your practice will succeed. So for instance, you know, the ethical aspect of the path, the sila aspect, so right speech, right action, right livelihood inside the Eightfold Path. These are not just good things for themselves, which they are. They're good for relationship, they're good for community, they're good for the well-being of your own heart. But they are also good for setting up the possibility that meditation goes deep. Because meditation going deep is really about the mind being able to let go and not obsess about things, right? To really relax. When am I really relaxed? One of the conditions for being really relaxed is that I'm not consumed with regret or doubt or remorse around something going on relationally. And so tending my words, tending my actions, and having a livelihood that's not creating drama in my heart, these are great conditions for meditation, right? Likewise, the wisdom aspects of the path, right view, right understanding, or right intention, these set up, a foundation for letting go. If I'm exploring the world through the lens of the noble truths, if I'm practicing right view, I'm really looking for, where's the dukkha? What am I holding on to? And I notice that, oh, here's a pattern. Here's a pattern of gripping, a pattern of holding on. What's happening here? What am I craving? What am I afraid of? What am I wanting? And as I explore that with right or wise view, I mature through it. I begin to let it go. And so it takes the cultivation of right view to be able to find the mind that has let go of enough that it can rest. Likewise, it takes right intention, right? The intention for generosity, for loving kindness, for letting go, for non-violence. It takes keeping the precepts, right? Not causing harm, not entering into situations that are going to churn up the heart, churn up the mind. And so all of the conditions of the path support the meditative states to really come to fullness. And so we set up the conditions for these states to be supported. And in a way, one of the best ways to not fall into craving them in the beginning stages of our practice, which, let's say in relation to these fetters, you're in the beginning stage of your practice if you're anywhere south of jhāna, and stream entry. So you're still working on basic letting go and concentration. Most of us are, almost all. We want to set up the conditions for our meditation to be strong, and then it's actually the strength of the whole path that we're on and the development of our skill in meditation that helps us not crave it so much, because it doesn't so much seem like a random accident. You don't want so sometimes you don't want to rely on like hoping things will go your way for a meditative state. You want to be able to find these states reliably, which means you've structured your life and you've practiced in order to have facility in these things. When I sit down at the piano, particularly if I'm am a performer or I have to do it in a kind of important situation, I want to be able to rely on my technique. I don't want to be like, okay, I hope I make it through this passage in the Chopin. Sometimes I make it, sometimes I crash and burn. I'm just like, maybe we'll make it today. If I'm in that situation, I haven't practiced enough, right? I'm not ready to perform it. Sometimes I practice playing chess, and one of the things that you try not to do as a chess player is play what's called hope chess, where you do a move and it's going to be a great sequence if your opponent makes a mistake. You're like, if they don't catch it, this is going to be great. But of course, they could totally catch it. And so you don't want to rely on them making a mistake in order for your sequence to work. You want to do the best move you can, but ideally you want to be enforcing sequences, right? Where you're really, you're driving the play. You're not just hoping that that they mess up. So, in the same way, I don't want to do hope meditation where I'm like, maybe it'll work out today, that my mind will be peaceful. I want to think of it as a craft, and I'm, just over time in a patient way, in a non-grasping way, I'm setting up the conditions for these states to be, more likely, more easily cultivated, more consciously attainable. in a way, that sounds like the talk is about how do we set up the conditions to get these states, not how do we let go of these states. And I think that's partly because it's not just that these fetters, grasping for jhāna and grasping for the formless states, it's not just that they stay with us all the way to the doorway of arahantship, to the doorway of full liberation, but actually that it's not useful to let them go until that point. It is actually useful for most of us who are not non-returners or once returners, you know, it is useful for us to work in a very disciplined and determined way to cultivate these states, right? Don't let them go too soon. And that's a little bit like I spend a lot of time in, well, like I'll stay with music. There's in the course of music history, in a certain way, you could track the development of Western music history as a pathway of extremely narrow rules about what was okay, and those rules widening and widening and widening and widening over several centuries. So in about the 10th century, in European classical music, so this is like Gregorian chant era, very, very tight rules about what a melody could do. And, by a few hundred years later, there were complex harmonies with very precise rules about how the voices work together. And a few hundred years after that, there was extremely complex harmonies, stuff that wouldn't have been allowed in the, mid-Renaissance was thriving, in the time of Beethoven. Crazy, nearly unresolved dissonances, wild stuff. What are the kids doing? Dad is like, I don't even know, Papa Haydn's like, oh my God, the kids are crazy. And like young Schubert's like, yeah, wild stuff is happening, and then it keeps going, keeps going, keeps going until, in the 20th century, like tonality breaks down and it's free form wildness, full crazy, modern noise music and car horns and sirens and, you know, um, you know, people playing in multiple keys all at once or no keys at all. And it just gets wider and wider. And I'll call the pinnacle of this, you could call it anywhere you want. You could call it John Cage, but I'm going to call it um, uh, Ornette Coleman's free jazz album. Um, and the concept of free jazz where um, where you just enter the mix, blowing wildly. Uh, I'm not going to say that it was completely free because Ornette Coleman's free jazz was actually, you can actually hear it in it, that it's actually just very, very blown open bebop. And so it's not actually what free, but it was a marker of like, what would it be like if we let go of all the rules of rhythm and tonality and timbre and structure and we went in blowing freely. And so there's lots of that in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then there was a backlash to that and disappeared. But let's say we got there. In the music world, I know people who, mostly young guys, who like that music and who can play a bit of their instrument. And then they come to the conclusion that because you can now play anything and any sound is okay in the piece, that they can then just blow wildly, or bang wildly on their instrument, and anything goes. And you can tell in this strange way, you can tell when someone's playing like that, playing in a free jazz way or in a free improvisational way. You can tell when there's really strong technique of whatever form behind it and a very rich vocabulary that they're drawing from versus someone who actually has not a lot of technique and a smaller vocabulary, but they have the ethos of absolute freedom. And there's actually, the music sounds different. You can't, it's very difficult actually to drop technique until technique is mature in you, right? The thing that ends up happening is that you don't have much of a vocabulary. I didn't think this is where this was going, But there you go. Shunryu Suzuki famously said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. Right? He was pointing to a particular hindrance that can happen when you think you're an expert in something and you get really narrow on like, what are the possible ways you could do this? And he was pointing in a very Zen way to a wide open frame of mind. So with all respect to Suzuki Roshi, I want to say that for a lot of us, that's not actually good advice. And that for the beginner, there's a very small vocabulary. So anything is possible, but you don't actually have the skills to do a lot. And actually, you haven't listened closely enough to even know what your options are. So people without a lot of technique, often they kind of play the same thing over and over, or they move the same way over and over, because they're not actually fluent in the language. In the expert's mind, there's a vast vocabulary. You've really learned what the possibilities are. And so for myself, I resonate with the opposite of what Suzuki Roshi said. In the mind of the experts, there's a lot of possibility because there's a lot of vocabulary. And in the mind of the beginner, there's not a lot of vocabulary. And so possibility is constrained, even though you have a kind of innocent sense of what can be done. But you don't have the facility to do it. So in meditation, I've come more to this over the years, to be honest. I've come more into the sense that that just sitting in a wide open way without cultivating the technique of either concentration or investigation, I don't see leading to breakthrough, to insight. Folks who deepen in open awareness generally do so by stabilizing awareness in a way as an object of concentration, right? It is a skill unto itself to be wide open, in the same way that to play good free jazz is absolutely a skill unto itself and takes very deep listening. In a certain way, it takes deeper listening to go wide open than it does to follow a form. You know, if I sit down in a jam session and we're playing a 12-bar blues, I can play it in my sleep and it's boring, or my playing of a 12-bar blues in my sleep is boring. If I go in and it's a really wide open, free soundscape, I have to really listen hard to figure out what exactly to do. I'm not just going to go in flailing. I actually want to really be attuned to the situation. And I think as meditators, we want to be attuned to the development of our meditation, and we want to cultivate these very deep states. And we don't let go of cultivating them until they're absolutely mature, right? And until they've borne fruit, right? Notice that these fetters dropping away with arahantship means you've already attained stream entry. And so don't let them drop away, particularly before stream entry, right? Because you need that kind of stability of mind to even to begin the uprooting process, seeing through Sakkaya Ditthi, seeing through doubt, seeing through the delusion of magic. So don't let go of your skills and your disciplined practice too early. And when it finally comes time to let them go, at the very end of the path, you really have taken the raft all the way across the river, and you're at the other shore. Don't let go of the raft in the middle of the river just because you hit a little sandbar and you're like, it's a resting place, and you let the raft float downstream. Make sure you're at the other side of the river, and then you put the raft down and you're free.